Welcome to the Traveling Flaneur podcast, where I'll talk about the economy, politics, history, and culture of the places I've visited. I'll also give you travel tips, recommend places to visit, things to do, and the best food. The life of a flaneur is that of an observer, a person who wanders aimlessly with eyes always open to any opportunity. It is a person who is in no hurry and prefers the journey over the destination. I believe that in this hurried world we live in, we need more flaneurs, and I hope you enjoy the perspective from a traveling flaneur and maybe become one in your next trip. Hi, and welcome to Toronto. Although Toronto isn't the official capital of Canada, it is considered the economic capital, and also some people consider it as if it was the New York of Canada. Toronto is definitely the largest city in the country, and it is one of the most diverse cities in the entire world because 50% of its population is born abroad. I currently live in this city, and I think that this is a city that if you can, you should visit because it is incredible and it has a mixture of parks, museums, modern buildings, and skyscrapers that includes a multiculturalism that doesn't exist in any other country that I have ever visited. There are many people who believe that Toronto is a very cold city. And although it can get to low temperatures during the winter, it is also true that this is a city that is very sunny, which makes that even in winter, you're going to always have sunny days and beautiful days. Actually, according to statistics, Toronto has 301 days of sunshine throughout the year, and this is higher than the average than most cities have. So unlike Vancouver, that's not as cold, that it's always raining, Toronto will be a little bit colder, not as cold as Montreal or Quebec City, but it's always going to be a very sunny city. In this episode and in the next one, I'm going to give you a list of all of the places that I recommend that you should visit in the city. But before that, I'm going to give you some travel tips for visiting Toronto. The first tip I can give you is where to stay in Toronto. And I would recommend that you look for something in downtown Toronto because this is where all of the touristy places are going to be. What I usually use is Airbnb because these ones are going to be a little bit more convenient when you're in one of those big cities like Toronto, but you're going to see that prices will be expensive. And a place that has one bedroom and a double bed might get to cost around $250 per night, obviously depending on when you're traveling or where the apartment is located. But since it's already expensive, I would recommend staying in nice areas because it's going to be almost the same price, but you can go out walking and enjoying for different restaurants or things in that neighborhood. So the three places that I would recommend as the best places to stay in Toronto would be Yorkville, the Annex, or Queen Street West. The second tip is going to be about transportation, because if you're traveling alone, I would suggest using the public transportation system in Toronto, which is called the TTC. But if you're traveling with more people, it may be cheaper to use Uber sometimes because you're going to see when you visit that this public transportation system will be a little bit expensive. One-way ticket will cost $350 and it's going to be valid for subway, buses, and trams, and it's also going to be valid for 2 hours. So if you can go in a return trip in only 2 hours, it's going to be relatively cheap. But if you're going for dinner and you are with more than 2 or 3 persons, it might be even cheaper to get an Uber because most likely the Uber in downtown will cost you around $10 to $15 wherever you go. And this is going to prove to be a little bit cheaper. And this is going to be a little bit cheaper if you are with more people than if you take the TTC. So this is something to consider. If you're going alone, TTC will for sure be the cheapest option. But if you have more people in your trip, you may consider taking an Uber. The last tip that I can give you is the best time to visit Toronto. I think September and October are the best months as it is going to be costing a little bit less because it's less touristy than the summer, but the weather is going to be perfect. It will be around 18 degrees Celsius and it's also going to be very sunny and you'll have the fall colors which are beautiful. If you come in April, you could also see the cherry blossoms, which are going to be another thing that's amazing to see in Toronto, but the weather will be a little bit colder. Either of these two times, what I would recommend is to dress with layers, because the bad thing in Toronto weather is not actually the weather per se, but it's the wind. Because usually you'll find that the wind is going to be very cold and you'll get a lot of wind that's going very fast. So that's what's going to make the real feel of the temperature be a bit lower than it actually is. So if you travel within this month, I would recommend you layering up. If you decide to visit in the summer months, it might be a little bit more expensive for tickets and maybe also for lodging, but it will for sure be beautiful as well because the weather is amazing. I was telling you earlier, but that because Toronto isn't as cold, the summer months are perfect here. So I would highly recommend if you want to travel in the summer, but know that it's going to be more expensive. And personally, my favorite months are going to be the fall months, so September and October. Now, let's move on into the best places that you should visit in Toronto. And my first list is going to be the most iconic landmark, which is the CN Tower. This tower, which is called the Canadian National Tower, is the largest broadcasting tower in America, with a height of 553 meters. It was the tallest in the world from 1975 to 2007, but that year it was surpassed by the Burj Khalifa, so you can already see that this is going to be a very tall tower. You can climb up to its observation deck, which is going to be 447 meters high, and over there you will have some amazing views of the entire city. Also, you may opt to go into the restaurant that is at the top, and this one is recommended if you want to have an elegant dinner and you have a special occasion to celebrate. Or if you like strong emotions, you could do a third thing at the top, which is called the Edge Walk. And over here, you're going to be walking outdoors on the edge of the tower at 356 meters high. So this plan you can't do if you are fearing heights. But either of these three plans you could do in this iconic place in Toronto. Truth be told, I find it a bit overrated and I haven't actually done it because it's quite expensive to do all of these things. I have usually been just to the tower and watched it from the bottom. And my rationale also for not going to the top is that if I go and I get the views of Toronto, I would be missing out on having the CN Tower in the skyline, which is one of the most distinctive things of Toronto. So I think you can have very amazing views from Toronto in other places, but personally I haven't been, so I can't tell you if I would recommend it or not. What I can tell you is that there is a city pass that's called Toronto City Pass, and this pass is going to give you access to the most popular attractions in Toronto, saving you 35% of the total, which is going to be around $55. So if you're planning on doing all of these tours, I would highly recommend it. The pass is going to cost $100 for adults and $72 for children, and the other attractions that are included in the City Pass besides from the CN Tower are going to be the Royal Ontario Museum, Casa Loma, and the Toronto Zoo. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about all of these other attractions, starting by the Royal Ontario Museum, also known as the ROM. This is the largest museum in Canada and the fifth largest in North America. And its impressive exterior is complemented by a vast museum that's filled with exhibits that speak to the past, present, and the future. Specifically, if I bring in numbers, the ROM has 13 million objects spanning from art, culture, and nature from all over the world and from all eras in this museum. And therefore, it is one of the most important cultural institutions in the entire continent, and I think this place most people like, because it includes art, it also includes natural history, and it includes science collections. Tickets are going to cost around $26, and I think this is a worthwhile visit if you can go. My only tip over here would be that the third Tuesday every month, you're going to be able to visit the ROM for free in the afternoons after 4:30 p.m. So if you want to save some money, maybe you can plan your visit in order to visit during these dates, but again, it's probably going to be very crowded. So if you're going to be paying, avoid the weekends because these are going to be the busiest day of the museum. The next attraction that's included in the City Pass is going to be Casa Loma, which is a huge mansion that's built in 1914 and will transport you to another era as soon as you enter because it looks like a Scottish castle that's in the middle of the modern part of the city. With the entrance fee, you can get a tour throughout all of its rooms, their gardens, and enjoy the view from Toronto that you get from the hill. And I think the spectacular gardens are the favorite part for most of the people, but this is going to be a good place if you want to visit kind of like a castle in the middle of a modern city. The last place that's included with the City Pass is the Toronto Zoo, which has a representation of almost 500 species of animals. And personally, I didn't visit this zoo, but I imagine that if you like these plants, it might be a good place to visit because of its big variety of animals. So for summarizing again, you have this Toronto City Pass that's going to take you to these 4 attractions, but I would only recommend it if you're planning to go to all of them, because if not, it might be a little bit more expensive. And if you only want to visit 2 out of these 4 attractions, it might be cheaper to get the individual tickets for this ones instead of buying the Toronto City Tour. But all of this to say that I think Toronto has a lot of great things. They are going to be just a little bit expensive, so consider the Toronto City Pass in case you want to visit all of them. Now, let's go to another thing that I do like, and I do recommend, but it's not included in the City Pass, and it's going to be the Aquarium. And this one I highly recommend it. It's probably one of my favorite places in Toronto, and I have visited several times. It is going to be located next to the CN Tower, and this aquarium has 5.7 million liters of water that hold about 500 marine species represented. So this is almost the same amount of species that you found in the zoo, but all of these ones are going to be marine species. So it is very impressive. And some hacks are that if you visit at night, you're going to have a small discount on your ticket. And there is also one night a month that's going to have a live jazz representation. So even though it's not free, you could try to go on this date because you're going to also be seeing some jazz performances while you're visiting the aquarium. Another place that you should definitely include in your Toronto visit would be the Distillery District. This is a very picturesque neighborhood that's full of brick buildings, and it's right now kind of the cultural center of the city. This neighborhood was formerly an industrial area, and it has become the heart of modern culture with trendy bars and restaurants that are going to be attracting lots of locals and tourists over there. But I think strolling and just walking through these cobblestone streets, it's like traveling back in time, but with a contemporary twist. So I would highly recommend it. If you're wondering about the name Distillery District, is because it comes from an old whiskey distillery. And the most fun thing to do over here is entering all of the small stores, restaurants, cafes, and inside those stores, you're going to find pieces of this distillery things that are still embedded in the place. So that's very fun. And you're also going to find very high quality stores over there. So for example, there's a chocolate store that's called Soma, and it has the best hot chocolate in town. So I would highly recommend just dedicating an entire afternoon or morning into walking through this neighborhood, enjoying it, and discovering the city like a flaneur. Another historic place that you should visit would be the St. Lawrence Market, and this is a food market that originally started in 1803, and although I'm not a big fan of food markets, this one is going to be a little bit special because you can sample a lot of food here from different parts, and also it's going to have good prices. So if you enter on the first floor, you're going to find the fresh produce stalls and some ready-made food stalls, but then if you go downstairs, here is where you can try the specialties from around the world at very low prices. And also, if you decide to go on Saturdays, on the north side of the St. Lawrence Market, you're going to find the Saturdays Farmers Market that's going to include high-quality organic products. The only thing that you should consider if you're visiting this market is that it closes on Mondays, so you can't visit it on Mondays, and the rest of the days it's also actually going to close early, so it's usually open from morning until 5 p.m. except for Saturdays, where it's going to close at around 3 p.m. So make sure to visit it early, and if you want to grab some food there, plan it to be lunch. The 8th recommendation that I want to give to you is going to be the Art Gallery of Ontario, or how it's known by its initial, the AGO. This museum has an impressive collection of contemporary art, including works by several international artists like Picasso, Van Gogh, or Henry Moore, and also architectonically is one of the best places to visit in Toronto. It has some beautiful stairs that are curved, and it's just a must-see place if you're interested in art or in architecture. One hack over here is that you could visit on a Wednesday between 6 and 9 p.m. and this museum is going to be free. And so, if you like museums, I'm going to give you several more recommendations. The first one would be the John Street Roundhouse that is going to hold the Railroad Museum. And even though this museum has no free days, the entry costs $14, so it's not as expensive, and in this place that started in 1929, the locomotives of the National Railroad Network were repaired and maintained. So inside the museum, you will see some historic trains and other elements such as a huge water tower. If you are more of a sculpture or art museum, you could also visit the Gardiner Museum, and this one is going to be free on Wednesdays after 4 p.m. There is also another good museum that's the Museum of Islamic Art, and this one is called the Aga Khan Museum. And here you're going to find 1,200 objects, manuscripts, and works that were assembled by Shah Karim al-Husseini and Prince Sajuddin Aga Khan. This museum is also free on Wednesdays from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m., so you might consider going to this one. Another museum that you could visit could be the Shoe Museum, which is going to take you on a historical tour of footwear. This one is called the Bata Shoe Museum, and it's free on Sundays. Finally, the last museum that you can visit doesn't have any free days, but it's one of the most popular in Toronto, and it's the Hockey Museum. And the proper name, it's the Hockey Hall of Fame. This Hall of Fame is dedicated to the history of hockey, and it has exhibits on players, teams, National Hockey League records, or NHL trophies, including the Stanley Cup. So if you like any or all of these museums, I would highly recommend it. As you could see, there's a trend on most of them being free on Wednesdays, so if you're only visiting Toronto for a couple of days, you might have to optimize which one to visit. Personally, my favorite would be the AGO, so Art Gallery of Ontario, but again, that's just my taste. You should visit whichever you prefer over the others. But, so I was just speaking of sports, and I think Toronto is going to be the perfect city to watch typical Canadian sports. You could go to hockey, baseball, basketball, or Canadian football game, and all of these ones are going to be a very typical Canadian experience. Clearly, the local sport is going to be hockey, so if your visit is going to be at the same time that the Toronto Maple Leafs is playing, I would highly recommend going to one of their games. They usually play at the Scotiabank Arena, and it's going to be a very exciting sport to watch. What few people know is that there's also another Toronto team that's called the Toronto Marlies, and for them you can find cheaper tickets, and if you're like me that you're not an expert in hockey, it will be also a very good game. And even though they're not the most famous team in Toronto, they will for sure play a game that will allow you to know hockey and learn a little bit more about the sport. At the Scotiabank Arena, you could also go and watch an NBA game if you prefer basketball. The home team is called the Raptors, and this team has won 6 division titles and made it to the playoffs 11 times and also won the NBA championship once. The only bad thing about NBA and Raptors is that the tickets are probably going to be more expensive for these games. If you want basketball, you'll have to pay a little bit more. But if you're looking for something cheaper but still local, you could go to a baseball game to watch the Blue Jays at the huge Rogers Center Stadium.
When I went, I sat in the section 538 and the prices were very cheap, and I also had an incredible view of the stadium with the CN Tower in the back. So I think if you find seats in this section or in nearby sections, they are going to be highly recommended. And finally, another typical local experience that you could have would be to watch a Canadian football game with the Toronto Argonauts. This sport is going to be very similar to American football, but it is only played in Canada, and they have a league in Canada called the CFL, or the Canadian Football League. And as you can see, this is going to be a very local experience that you can only find in this country, and it can be a fun plan if you're into sports. So with this, I'm going to complete my first Teen Toronto recommendations, and in my next episode, I will continue my list to tell you about other places that you should include in your visit, but I'm going to include some that are less touristy, and they will also show you how amazing this city is. If you like this episode, please share it with someone else who loves to travel, and give me a review, because this helps me tremendously and motivates me to give you more travel tips. Subscribe to stay tuned for more episodes, and tell me in the comments if there's anything that surprised you or if there's any advice that you found extremely useful. I hope to see you next week so we can keep exploring Toronto and I can show you some of the best spots in the city. Enjoy your trip!